Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Karen Butter, and I'm president of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We're going to start in just a minute, but I want to give everyone a chance to log on to the webinar. In the meantime, welcome. And we're so glad you're joining us this evening to learn about the amazing photography of Dorothea Lange. Tonight, we will be joined by one of our favorite docents, Avril Angevine. We'll get going in just a minute. Before we get started, I want to review technical details. This is a live webinar. The audio for the audience is muted and the video is turned off, so you will only see the speaker and her images. And we are recording this event. Please use chat to introduce yourselves and to ask questions and send comments. We love to hear where you're located. And please be respectful in your comments. Before I turn it over to tonight's docent, I want to talk briefly about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We are a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for an outstanding public library in Alameda. The Friends at Home events provide an opportunity to connect with you and to share common experiences. A special thanks to our supporters for their ongoing donations so that we can continue to honor our commitments to the library and to support future Friends at Home events. We ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable for you via our website at alamedafriends.com. Or use the direct link listed in the chat. We are excited that we're joined by longtime favorite docent, Avril Angevine, who has presented a number of outstanding programs for us. Avril has a lifelong interest in art, sparked by her first museum visit to LACMA and watching docents explaining a work of art to a group of visitors. Those early memories sparked an interest in her work as a docent. She is an independent art lecturer and teaches humanities and English at local colleges. And in normal times, she is a museum guide for both SF MoMA and the Oakland Museum. Tonight, Avril will introduce us to the photography of San Franciscan Dorothea Lange, That Such Things Could Be. Please join me in welcoming Avril back to Friends at Home, and a reminder to use chat to ask questions or send your comments. Avril?
Thank you, Karen. Great to be here with everyone. Oh, there we are. Great to be here with everyone at home, Friends at Home. It's a cool title. Let me pull my image up here and we will get started. Slideshow from the beginning. So there we are, Dorothea Lange, That Such Things Could Be. So we're going to talk about a hometown hero today. Actually, Karen said San Francisco. She worked in San Francisco, but she lived in Berkeley and in Oakland. Dorothea Lange. Now, there's, of course, many ways we can assess her work. As with any other photographer, we can look at it formally, that is how she composed her images. We can look at it sort of through the lens of social activism, which was very, very important to her. And we can look at it from the point of view of a woman photographer, so maybe from almost a feminist perspective, or at least a female perspective in these works. And we'll maybe talk about all three of these things as we go along and look at the images. So now, even if you don't know a lot about photography, I know that you know two names, and they're Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams. Now, they're both not just from California, but also from the Bay Area. They knew one another. They often worked together, although their goals for photography were often quite different. Now, in 1932, when Ansel Adams and Edward Weston were planning the photo exhibit that announced the arrival of Group F64 and straight photography, that is photography that celebrated, photography like this, that celebrated what the camera could do, clear and sharp, excellent use of black and white, and no longer tried to make photographs look like a painting. At that time, when they had the exhibit, they considered asking Dorothea Lange to join them. But at that time, she was doing studio portraits and her work was not considered pure enough. Well, quite soon, Lange became a master of clear-eyed, sharp images that used the techniques of F64, but went far beyond their goals. Their goals were entirely formal, what the photograph looked like. But Lange went beyond this, using those kinds of skills to create unforgettable images that shone a light on the dark corners of the American experience in the Depression, during the war years, and in the complicated post-war world. She showed us people often in despair and asked how such things could be. So let's see how she did it. So Dorothea Nutzhorn was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1895. She contracted polio when she was 7, and although she recovered her mobility, she had a limp for the rest of her life, which makes the energy and stamina she brought to her documentary work in the 30s close to miraculous. Her father separated from the family when Dorothea was 12, at which time Dorothea and her mother and brother, here's her mother, moved to New York. She spent many hours as a girl wandering the crowded streets of the Lower East Side, and she would later say that this is where she learned to see. These years also taught her that the poor possessed dignity and humanity, and that if she put on what she called her cloak of invisibility, which is a term she used many times later in life, she could see without being disruptive or without herself being unsafe. So as a teenager, she expanded her walks around town to include upscale New York, museums, mansions, and galleries of modern art. And perhaps she even visited Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Fifth Avenue Gallery, which opened in 1905 and was the place to see modern art in America, including contemporary trends in photography. There it is down below the Save New York committee, which was successful because New York is still there. They must have saved it. Now, Stieglitz himself from Hoboken, interestingly enough, and his protege, Edward Steichen, were proponents of pictorialism. This was a style in which photographers aimed to prove once and for all that photography could produce art. This was contested right from the beginnings of photography in the 1830s. It was, of course, originally used for kind of more scientific purposes, although there were always those who were creating artworks. But by the turn of the century, they were really attempting to make photographs artistic by using a range of darkroom techniques to create kind of moody, fuzzy, almost crafted compositions. And they would use different darkroom techniques. They would use different kind of papers to print on and so forth. Sometimes they tinted them. This is he's taking photographs of clouds. And of course, this famous, gorgeous image, the Flatiron Building by Edward Steichen. Now, pictorialism was the style for photography at the turn of the century, when Lange, who graduated from high school in 1912, announced that she wanted to be a photographer, and this despite not even having held a camera. Okay. Her first job was in the studio of Arnold Genthe, one of the most famous early photographers of San Francisco, who had moved back east, presumably to the greener photographic pastures of New York in 1911. Now, Genthe actually shot the only extant photos of Chinatown, San Francisco's Chinatown, before the earthquake. And he's considered at this point a pictorial photographer. The image on the left of Chinatown doesn't have the same kind of wonderful fuzzy quality and moody quality as the fabulous picture of Garbo there on the right. But his Chinatown pictures are kind of considered pictorialist because he did doctor them. He would crop out or block out anything that looked too Western, right, to try and get the image that he wanted. Let's see, he's also known for photographs of Isadora Duncan, right? He was really a guy, that's a lovely one, right? Lovely image. Okay. Now, Lange learned a lot from Genth, including something that became a trademark of hers, which was to click the shutter when the sitter didn't expect it. And he gave her her first camera. But Dorothea soon developed a kind of wanderlust, so she and a school friend saved up money for a trip around the world. And as the famous story goes, she made it to San Francisco before she lost her money. And this is when her life as a professional photographer really began. She got a job at a photo shop where she became fascinated by snapshots, in which she realized photographs could tell a social as well as a personal story. She met Roy Partridge in the shop and quickly became friends with him and his wife, Imogen Cunningham. Here's a couple of photographs of Roy, who I think you could have to say is a good sport here. He was an artist himself, a printmaker, and he taught at Mills College. And I think you can see by looking at these two, I don't have dates on them, but the one on the left is more pictorial, so it's earlier. He looks like he's communing with nature out in a beautiful setting, whereas the one on the right is really kind of a more of an F64 approach. It's about shapes and shadows and things like that. It takes a while looking at it to figure out actually what's going on in there. Okay, so Lange eventually set up a photography studio at 540 Sutter Street, right near Union Square, that was successful beyond her wildest dreams, serving the same wealthy clientele as Genth had when he was there. Her modern, artistic, intimate, and still fairly pictorialist style appealed to the residents of San Francisco. And I thought you'd like to see. This is the young Haas brothers. Here by the later 20s, we're starting to lose the pictorial edge and get a little bit sharper. And the Haas boys not only had their photograph taken by Dorothea Lange, but they were painted in a mural by Diego Rivera. And it doesn't get much better than that. So Lange at 26 was the top portrait photographer in the city, and she met the city's most dramatic artist, Maynard Dixon, and they were soon married. Now, Dixon, probably know his name, was quite the man about town. He was very, very interested in Western art, Western scenes. He was both a fine artist and a graphics designer, a graphic artist. And as you can see, Sunset Magazine was already around at this time, did lots of covers for them and so forth. But he's also a really excellent painter. This is from later, from the 30s, called Forgotten Man. I think it's a wonderful image. Now, this was a magic couple, there they are, but even they were not immune to the effects of the Depression, financial effects, emotional, and even moral effects of the Depression. In the spring of 1932, Dorothea turned from the walls of her studio, decorated with photos of her clients, the Fleischackers, the Haasses, the de Youngs, and so forth. And she looked out the window down at the crowds of unemployed and sort of understood the Depression for the first time. As she said, the discrepancy between what I was working on and what was going on in the streets was more than I could assimilate. I thought I would go down there to see if I could grab a hunk of lightning. Accompanied by her brother, who was out of work, she headed out into the streets with her giant Graflex camera and her tripod. And on the first day out, she snapped the White Angel breadline. Okay, the White Angel was a woman who ran this soup kitchen for people. I think it was down on the Embarcadero. So this is a completely different kind of image, and it tells us a lot about Dorothea Lange, and it's going to predict a lot of what she does as a photographer. So she is focused in on the one man who's going the other way. And we can see by looking in here, the Depression, 1 out of 4 people was out of work. 2 million people were riding the rails around the country. And as we can see here, it wasn't just factory workers and people like that, bankers, small businessmen, farmers. We can see by the range of hats here, there's all kinds of different people down there waiting for a handout. She loved portraiture, but she often said that she didn't like just taking pictures of people who paid her money to do it. So now with this, she's not only taking pictures of people who aren't paying her, but they might not even want their picture taken. This is a stunning image in which she is using the rails in front of him as a device to push back into the picture plane. And it's almost like he's in an attitude of prayer, the man there with his cup and his hat down. And it's beautifully balanced in colors and so forth. It's a great, great photograph. So she did that. A couple of other images she took in those early days in San Francisco. Now, the one on the left, this is interesting because in many ways, this would be kind of like an F-64 photograph. It's a sharp and clear photograph of an object, right? A wheelbarrow and a person who kind of looks like an object, but this has a kind of a story in it. And that's what always interested her. And in the one on the right, we can see that one of the things she does frequently is to shoot a little bit from below, to shoot up, which monumentalizes the face. And of course, he's looking off. His cap is looking in the same direction. The collar of his shirt is going in the same direction. She was always concerned to make the people she photographed in the worst days of their lives, to make them look as good as she could, as positive as she could. Now, her friends and her clients asked what she was going to do with images like these, but she had an idea. And within 3 years, she had closed her studio and she had changed what it meant to be a documentary photographer. In fact, she may have created what it meant, created documentary photography. So in a couple of years, by 1934, she had her first show of her new works at 683 Brockhurst. That's the Oakland studio where F-64 was centered and where it was born. Now, at this exhibition was a man named Paul Taylor. He was a UC Berkeley agricultural economist, and he was blown away by Dorothea Lange's work. He saw immediately the power of these images and how they could help enliven his rather dry economic reports that he was making about the conditions of people coming into California to work and to live. So he invited a group of photographers, including Lange and Imogen Cunningham, to accompany him on a trip to document a self-help community being set up by the unemployed in Oroville. This is when Taylor actually met Lange for the first time. Now, I can't be sure that it was love at first sight, but Taylor was impressed by the first photo that Lange took as soon as she got out of the car, and it was this one. And I think you can see why he was impressed. There is just so much attitude. There's so much going on in that photograph. And she was impressed by the way he talked to the workers and that he was studying, getting them comfortable, getting them to reveal a lot about their lives and their plight. And this too became a standard practice for Lange. And her photos were often accompanied by long captions about or sometimes by her subjects. In effect, she collaborated with her subjects to gain their trust. She would even let children fiddle with her cameras, which is kind of hard to believe. So here they are, Lange and Taylor, in a photograph by Imogen Cunningham. So from 1935, when she divorced Maynard Dixon, to 1939, Lange and Taylor formed an incredible partnership, he writing and she photographing, bringing attention to the plight of the nation's poor and forgotten people, especially sharecroppers, displaced families, and migrant workers. The photos were commissioned by various New Deal agencies, and they were distributed free of charge to newspapers, which were attempting to gain support for the federal programs to provide aid to the people. They worked in California, they worked in the South, they worked in Texas, they worked in Washington State. I want to look at a few of the photographs she took in these years. So in the South, right, again, shot from below. Now, also shot from below. This is interesting. So the South was kind of a revelation for Lange and for other of the FSA photographers too. The South was really picturesque, if we can put it that way. And people had a hard time staying focused on the topic because the landscape and the scenery was so engaging, so beautiful, and so different from what they were used to. They were asked not to photograph really outrageous examples of abuse of Black Americans. But of course, in the South, things were exacerbated by the Depression, but we're dealing with a situation that is more than economic, that predated the Depression and postdates it too. So we'll see how she works with this idea. A couple more, but she's very, very good with signs, as you will see. And some more pictures from the South. Oh, this one I find really interesting. It's in North Carolina, in a tobacco growing region. And this is kind of an interesting example of how she would go about her work, because on the one hand, it's a lovely photograph with lots going on at this kind of general store. And everybody's on the porch and they look kind of cool. There's almost like a friendly atmosphere, but the owner clearly is standing in the doorway and with his hand up like this, kind of blocking entrance here to the people. And around we see the gas tank, we see all these interesting advertising signs. So we know that this is where they got everything, where their lives were centered. And the guy who ran the store was really instrumental. He handed out loans, all sorts of things. I mean, it's just like in the Grapes of Wrath, it's just like in Steinbeck's A Company Store. So this is kind of a subtle picture that actually does tell us something about the social relationship between the man in the door and the people sitting on his porch. It's a nice image. More. This is some in Washington State. It's again a woman looking off. I like how her hat is repeated behind her by the tent. Man picking apples, and yeah, there's a story there we can figure out. And this is a quite well-known image called The Damaged Child. She often focused on women and children all through her career. They were an important subject no matter where she was. Okay, now 22 of the photographs she took as part of the FSA, the Farm Securities Administration, were included in John Steinbeck's The Harvest Gypsies when it was originally published as 7 articles in the San Francisco News in 1936. And there's an image there that I'm sure you recognize, we're going to talk about in a second. This was later published as a pamphlet called Their Blood is Strong. 10,000 copies of it were sold for 25 cents each. Let's look at some more of her photographs in California. This is an interesting photo. These are Filipino laborers near Salinas picking lettuce. And there's so much of interest in this photograph. I love the way she's placed herself so that she sees the dry, cracked dirt. Obviously a drought, we're familiar with that. Where the cracks in the earth kind of have the same shape as the lettuces. So there's all this repetition of shape. And then the men, I assume they're mostly men, bent over one after another. So all this uniformity and repetition in this image, which is very interesting anyway. Here's like, see, another one from California, another family picture. Here's one. And I like the way that, to know what particularly is going on here, not much, but the man is leaning on a hoe, right? That's a work implement that he's using to identify himself, we might say. And again, children. And this young man on the right, I mean, apparently teenagers were often cut loose from their families, young men, and were traveling the rails too, trying to make their way. Sort of an extraordinary photograph on the left of this family. It's really interesting to think if she were around now, what kind of things she would be photographing in Oakland with the homeless that we have. And I don't know if anybody does images of the same intensity as she does, but the situation is so different with imagery today. Okay, another one. Yeah, there's final couple of images. And on the left, I love this photograph that's structurally really interesting. There's the squares of the window and the rivets that's at an angle. And then the man leaning out. And if you notice, the shadow under his arms makes a V. Right next to it, there's the V from Viva Mexico, Mexico written on the train and so forth. It's interesting. So she always manages to create really formally interesting images. So, and as I said, she stressed the life of families, mothers, and children, as did Steinbeck in his text. So, on a winter's day in 1936, Lange was driving home from an assignment in Southern California. She was on 101 near Nipomo, near the dunes, and she saw a sign pointing to a pea pickers camp. A frost had killed the crop, and people were desperate. Lange was drawn like a magnet, she said, to one group, a woman with several children. She kept moving closer, and in 10 minutes, she shot 6 images. The 7th has become the best known documentary photograph of the 20th century, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity, and that's Migrant Mother. So I want to show you some photographs in the sequence to sort of talk about how she went to work. So here's the first one. So this is like an establishing shot in a movie. And we can see that it's February. The ground is frosty. It looks cold. There's no plants or anything. And we can see that the children don't even have sweaters on. The teenage girl in the front is not wearing shoes. So this might surprise you that there's a teenage girl here on the left. She doesn't appear in any of the other photographs. And I think Dorothea maybe thought that she was distracting from the thing. So she's going to move in closer. Let's see what she does next. Oh, okay. So she's moved in and she's isolated the nursing mother in a shot that, has echoes of a Madonna, but possibly a little too much breast there for family newspapers where these were being published. And remember, they were designed to elicit sympathy for the people and their plight. So this maybe has a little too much going on. So let's try again. And now we've got this. This image, actually, originally it was thought that there were only 6 images. This one was found in the archives at the Oakland Museum. So this one, similar to the last one, I like the mother's look, but okay, the child, right? So whenever you have more than one person in a photograph, we've all taken photographs like this, where somebody is just, either there's a red eye or whatever, somebody is just not happening. So this one's not going to work. Let's see what more we can do. Now, in this photograph, which is doing pretty much what she wants to do, and we can see it says Life magazine down there, it was published. She's moved the trunk, closed it, and moved it into the picture with the tin, the empty bowl on it to create part of a narrative. But I don't know. I think she could do a little more. Is there maybe too much going on in there? I mean, maybe the pole is a little bit distracting. The child does look a lot better in this photograph, but maybe we could do a little bit more. So the key to it, Lange has discovered, is the mother's face. So she asks her to bring her hand up to draw attention to her face, which is a device she's used many times, right? And she does. And finally, we get the money shot. Okay, so this one, why does this work? It's much closer in. Hand is up on the face. Now we've got 3 children. The problem with the breast is gone because the baby's not nursing. We've actually got 2 children, but because they're cuddled, like looking behind her, they're not distracting from the main face. So this is a really masterful image that she got very, very quickly, and not in her usual kind of practice where she would spend a lot of time with the family. When this was first printed in the San Francisco News, the caption was "Broke, Baby Sick, and Car Trouble." And in fact, the photograph was so powerful that $200,000 in donations for people were collected. But as I said, she had less interaction with this family than she normally did. And so, for example, she said that they told her they had sold the tires on the car for food. And two older sons actually disputed this. Maybe she didn't remember correctly or didn't take enough notes. What is known is that the mother, the migrant mother, her name was Florence Thompson, was a full-blood Cherokee from Oklahoma. When her husband died, she was left with 6 children to support by picking cotton. When the photo was taken, she was 33 years old, 8 years younger than Lange. And she, her second husband, and the 6 children were moving around the Central Valley picking crops. She spent the rest of her life in California, ended up with 10 children, actually. And in 1979, Thompson contacted the Modesto Bee and identified herself as the iconic migrant mother. She was actually angry that she had never received a cent from this most famous photograph. Of course, Lange didn't either. It's always been in the public domain, and she was on salary as a government photographer at the time. Nevertheless, Thompson actually collected $35,000 in donations after the photograph was published, after her story was publicized in the Bee, which paid off her medical debts, and she outlived Dorothea Lange by 10 years. Now, Lange and Taylor published their work in a book of text and photographs on the Dust Bowl called American Exodus in 1939, covered wagon 1939 style. Okay, so in 1941, Lange was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for achievement in photography, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor, she gave up this prestigious award to record the forced evacuation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And at this point, she was working on assignment for the War Relocation Authority, or the WRA, which wanted to show that the evacuation process was humane. So why they hired Dorothea Lange is a bit of a mystery. They apparently weren't familiar with her work. But she traveled throughout Northern and Central California to photograph families being rounded up to leave. She visited several temporary assembly centers and eventually did a series at Manzanar, the first of the permanent internment camps. Much of her work focused on the waiting and uncertainty involved in the removal. And this photograph was taken just down the street from the Oakland Museum, where the Oakland Museum is today. And this one is certainly one of the most powerful images of this series. The owner of the store was a graduate of UC Berkeley, and he had this sign put up the day after Pearl Harbor, but within 3 or 4 months, he was gone. He was interned. She liked to stress that the internees, 120,000 of them, 80,000 of whom were actually US citizens, were just ordinary people who do what all Americans do. She was very good with children, as you can see. But let's look at this interesting one as an artwork. So Dorothea Lange, I mean, when you're a photographer working with a camera, with a lens, you get very good at isolating the important elements of an image because there's lots outside that's not being shown. And we saw with Migrant Mother how she was able to do that with the camera, but she could also do it by cropping. So she would crop the images often to show what she wanted to show. So in this wonderful image at Raphael Weil School in San Francisco, of a group of children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, we have 3 Asian girls in the front. And they're all interesting, and they all look really different, and they all tell a different story. And depending on how we crop the image, different ideas come through. So this is the full image. We have lots of kids in the background and so forth. And then she crops it down to these two. Now, this also makes a powerful image, I think, because they're wearing such similar coats and they're the same size and everything, but the expression on their faces is completely different. And I think that what Dorothea Lange probably wanted to show is better represented in the girl on the left, who looks a little bit frightened, a little bit hesitant, and that's how the final crop looks. And this says it all. And this girl's family was gone 10 days after this photograph was taken. Okay. Now, she also, as I said, photographed at Manzanar. Her internment images were so obviously critical that the army impounded almost all of them, and they weren't seen publicly for more than 50 years. This one actually was seen, I think, because there are no people in it. It's just a kind of a landscape shot. Today, her photographs of the internment are available in the National Archives. They have a set at the Bancroft Library too. Let's look. So another image, wonderful image she did. So once again, shot slightly from below to monumentalize the figure, man with a bright white shirt with his little grandson, presumably, up on his shoulders. Really powerful image of just tenderness and love, kind of, they're sharp in the front, you know, not so clear in the background. Wonderful image. This one too, interesting how the barbed wire is leading, kind of forming an arrow going back into the photograph. They were asked not to photograph the more inhumane aspects of this inhumane process, such as barbed wire, but nevertheless, she did this one. And a photograph of people in a line, very stark kind of area they were living in. Now, meanwhile, Lange's old friend, Ansel Adams, was looking at the 30s through a slightly different lens. Most of the F-64 photographers turned, as Lange did, to social documentary work as the Depression got worse by the end of the Depression. But Adams and Edward Weston, however, continued to photograph rocks and trees, a rather unpopular pursuit in that desperate decade. Adams, okay, so this is how Ansel Adams photographs Manzanar, right? Completely different, where I think it's called Mount Williamson. It's presented as a barrier, it's a fortress, but it's also like an inspiration. He wrote that humanity needs the purely aesthetic just as much as it needs the purely material. And you know, I can't really disagree with that. Imogen Cunningham's son, Rondell Partridge, who worked with both Adams and Lange, said, Ansel once complained to me, and he said it to Dorothea too, that he didn't understand why she took all these photographs of dirty, sad things when there's so much beauty. Ansel himself never photographed a fence, a street, drunk people, or junk, so he couldn't understand. He was an art photographer, and she was a people's photographer. And I think that's a little bit too stark a separation between them, but it's going in the right direction. By the time the war broke out, Adams was still in his cocoon of beauty, but maybe starting to come out of it a little bit. And in his photos of the Japanese internment camps, which he, like Lange, was adamantly against, he considered them un-American, he stresses humanity, perhaps, rather than its lack. He was there a little bit later than Lange, so people had possibly established kind of routines. Here we see a man making a sign. They had gotten a way of life going on a little bit in there. And can you be more American than a baton twirler at Manzanar? It's almost surreal in a way. He eventually published a book called Born Free and Equal. Here it is, which is a photo and textbook about Manzanar that accompanied an exhibit of his photographs at MoMA, New York. It was controversial because he was critical of the effort in this text, but you'll notice on the cover here that the human figure is on the back cover, not on the front. The front is landscape. Now, in 1942 and 43, Lange and Adams both examined a kind of more optimistic aspect of wartime life, and that was at the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, again for the War Relocation Authority. And then they went back in 44, 45 for Fortune magazine. Now, the population of Richmond before the war was 20,000. After war broke out, the Kaiser shipyard employed over 100,000 workers in what became, at that time, the world's shipbuilding center. Lange was fascinated by the ethnic and racial mix of people in the shipyards, which she found exhilarating and a harbinger of the future. Now, largely, let's look at a picture. Up in there. Largely, this was due to the need for workers, wartime workers, women, so forth, and African Americans were coming to the West Coast for this work. But that's not the only reason this happened. It was sort of the culmination of several decades of agitation by African American leaders. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the first African-American labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, he and the Urban League and the NAACP threatened a large march on Washington until Roosevelt ended segregation in the wartime workforce and in government wartime industries. And that resulted in jobs for African Americans and women in the factory. So this is a real fun image, quitting time. Love that. And here's one of these diversity kind of celebrations here. In this photograph, we can see all kinds of people. So number one, it's odd to have women in a factory setting, and we have different races represented. There's some Black gentlemen in the front and some more in the back. We can tell once again by the hats that people have different kinds of jobs. Some are kind of hard hat jobs. Others have more, maybe they work in the business office or something. But Dorothea's own comment about this photograph talks about the isolation. Here's a crowd where nobody's touching, nobody's talking to each other, except these two in the front. Talking about the lonely crowd kind of, and how she saw that as what the future was going to be like. It's an interesting work. So yes, we had African Americans working in the factory. Generally, white men got the best jobs. You know, after that, white women, then Black men, Black women. But here we have a photograph of a Black woman welder, so that would be a good job. And it's a wonderful photograph. She's outdoors, probably enjoying being in the sun just for a little while. It's very cool. And here's another one. I like them leaning on the parking meter. This is like time is passing, right? This photograph, you know, in 5 years, you're going to look at it. It's not going to look like this. It's interesting. And here's another image where she, again, shooting from below, and she makes a wonderful use of this sign, serve yourself. I like that. Okay. Now, their methods of working, Lange's and Ansel Adams, were comically different. Lange wore her cloak of invisibility as she wandered around photographing, but Ansel Adams, however, who wore a big 10-gallon hat and had this bushy beard, attracted attention as he set up his bulky photography equipment. And according to a woman who worked with both of them, she said, Dorothea treats Ansel like a baby brother, telling him what to do. He has great respect for her work, although he makes horrible comments about it. But you can see that Lange did have some influence on Adams, though, in this photograph, Trailer Park Children from Richmond in 1944. So after the war, 1945, Lange was invited by Ansel Adams to accept a position at the new Fine Art Photography Department at the California School of Fine Arts in San Francisco, today known as the Art Institute. Imogen Cunningham and Minor White also joined the faculty at that time. And in her work there, we find the only selfie she really ever took, and it's a picture of her foot. She apparently assigned one of her classes to do a photo essay about where they lived, and they challenged her to do the same thing, and this is what she came up with. Kind of cool. So Lange continued to work as a photojournalist in the 1950s. She and Perkle Jones were commissioned by Life magazine to shoot a photographic documentary of the death of Monticello, California, and of the displacement of its residents to form Lake Berryessa. The magazine didn't run this piece, but the photo collection was shown at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1960. I'll show you, it starts out with this wonderful image in which I can't tell if the barn actually is it looks like it's at some sort of angle, and I don't know if that's just because of the way the earth is in front of it or what. It's a beautiful image. And this one, the horse, and this is interesting, unusual. There's no horizon. So there's no way out, really, for this horse. More lovely photographs of this area that is about to be gone. And friendly neighbor, always putting a positive spin on things, was Dorothea. Except for this. Yeah, there's the bulldozer, there's the enemy, a really interesting photograph. So she did other series in the 50s. One particular one she did for Life magazine, which she began in 1954, featured public defender Martin Pulich, whose commitment to serving the poor and troubled resonated with her own values. So these were shot at the Alameda County Courthouse, which, as you know, is right across the street from the Oakland Museum. And in this one, we can see that the man on the right, obviously, is the lawyer, who later became a judge in Alameda County, quite a distinguished judge. I find it interesting that physically he and his client kind of resemble each other, but his posture and everything, it makes it seem that he likewise is a little bit weighted down by the system. These are kind of interesting photographs in that in the late 50s and the 60s, most of us, including Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, were watching Perry Mason, and that was kind of our idea about what it was like in a courtroom. That's not really what we see here. And we also see in these pictures Lange's abiding concern with the women and the children who are there. And this is a very interesting image that what is the story here? It's, you can make up a story imagining that these two people are together or they're separate. Could they be separate? Could they both be coincidentally just sitting on this bench in the same attitude? Or are they a couple in which it's presumably the man who's just gotten some bad legal news and his wife is suffering with him? Could be that. Lange cropped this down. I didn't put one up, but you can do that yourself by going like this. She cropped it to just the woman. I myself prefer the photograph this way because I think it's a little bit mysterious about what's going on, and the fact that they are in almost the same position seems to kind of double the agony here. I like it better that way myself. So she did other assignments too, kind of interesting portraits of the times. Now, this photograph, I'm sure you love it as much as I do. And again, it's this thing with a camera and the lens, and what you see through the camera is not everything. And it's entirely possible that this little boy's mother is behind him, that that's not his mother. If it is his mother, it's kind of a different image, and it's rather fun like that. And possibly because of her own problems with her foot, she somehow has a lot of photographs of feet, legs, ankles, like this one. She did a series in Mormon villages in Utah that this is from. And she traveled around the world with her husband, Paul Taylor, who was at that time a consultant for the State Department. So she did a lot of photography. And in the last decade of her life, Lange's health was poor, and she stayed close to home, creating a really nice series of family photos. in which, once again, we can see her unerring eye for cropping, for getting the telling image here with these hands in both cases. And there's a lovely little story about this photograph, Mother's Day Daisies, where one of her two sons, with Maynard Dixon, when he was a little boy, collected these for Mother's Day. And of course, when your mother's Dorothea Lange, what does she do with your gift? She takes a picture of it, right? There she goes. Now, Lange died in 1965. She was 70. 3 months later, the Museum of Modern Art in New York mounted a retrospective show of her work, which she herself had helped to curate in the months before her death. There she is with John Sharkovsky. The following year, her unique collection became a gift to the Oakland Museum of California from Paul Taylor. And the collection includes Lange's personal negative file of over 25,000 images, over 6,000 vintage prints, which means prints that she made or had made at the time, and a selection from her personal papers and library. There's even some cameras in there. And just this past year, the museum has opened the Dorothea Lange Digital Archive, making 20,000 images available online for anyone to see. In 2006, an elementary school was named in her honor in Nipomo, California, near the site where she photographed Migrant Mother. And in 2018, she was immortalized in a mural in her hometown of Hoboken, New Jersey, with two other local women who, like Lange, pushed boundaries for women and asked how such things could be. So Dorothea Lange's collected works are available in the Library of Congress, in the National Archives, and at the Oakland Museum of California, which has just reopened, by the way. So I'm going to end here, and I wonder if anyone, I see there's some things in the chat. Oh dear, how shall I do this? If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask.
Avril, I can ask some questions for you.
Okay.
And I'll monitor the chat as well.
Okay, thank you.
It's a fascinating insight into Dorothea Lange, and I had no idea.
I just lost you there, Karen.
Somebody's trying to help me, and I'm helping myself too. Okay. I would like to say that we had foresight in planning, but our last author talk was George Takei, and he talked a lot about his book, growing up in a Japanese relocation camp. And so we saw and heard from him about Manzanar as well. So it really is an interesting juxtaposition. So, you know, we're really fortunate. We have a few questions that I wanted to ask of you. Let's see. A couple panelists said this is fascinating to see after the last webinar on George Takei.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There was also a question about, was it Steinbeck article a precursor for the Grapes of Wrath? Or you know, you talked about.
Yes, I think it was published before the Grapes of Wrath. Well, there was a well, yeah, he was gathering information all the time, but it was published before the Grapes of Wrath, yeah.
And somebody else said, I've seen this photo so many times, and yet this is the first time I've seen the baby. And I thought it was really interesting showing the different photos that she took in order to get the one that, you know, really told the story.
Well, that's an interesting aspect of film photography, that to get one image, you often have to take many, and there's just like the one shot that does it. It's kind of fascinating, but yeah. But that wasn't too bad. That was 7 shots, and she got that one, so she was pretty good. But yeah.
You talked a little bit about her early life, but really, where did she learn photography, or did she just learn it as she was doing it?
I believe she learned it from Arnold Gantz. She worked in his studio. And as I said, he taught her how to use the camera. He gave her a camera. And other than that, I think she just learned it on the fly. I mean, she didn't study it. She was apparently not a good student. walking around New York instead of going to school when she was young. But I think she just, she worked in a photo shop in San Francisco, developing pictures and so forth. And I guess just learned by doing, really. How she managed so early to have a studio like she did and be doing these portraits for very, very, upscale families. It's kind of amazing, but her work was very good.
The other thing that's fascinating is how she gravitated toward the social issues,
Yeah.
rather than staying in the same lane that Ansel Adams was
Yeah.
doing, these really nice photographs.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think, I don't know, I suppose in a way it's more incredible that Ansel Adams stayed in his lane during the 1930s, how you could kind of avoid what was going on around you. But she certainly took up that challenge for sure.
Yeah. You talked about her first husband, Maynard Dixon. I haven't heard about him before. Is he very well known? He may be very well known, and I just don't know.
He's pretty well known. I mean, he's not one of the artists that you would hear of necessarily from California, but he's pretty well known. Yeah, pretty well known. Together at the time, they were both like the stars of San Francisco, kind of, but she has far eclipsed him these days. But he's a really good painter. But he did do a lot, like I said, a lot of commercial art and things like that, and that tends to lower your profile, I guess.
Were her photographs appreciated during her lifetime?
Yes, I think so. I mean, she worked for these government agencies and got a lot of them published. So yeah, I think they were.
And I had a question about why did the government agencies hire her to do, and others to do the photographs? What was their objective in that?
Well, yeah, they wanted publicity. And I guess like Paul Taylor, they understood that a picture is worth 1,000 words. At least if it's done by Dorothea Lange, it's probably worth 10,000 words. So they had, Walker Evans, all sorts of really powerful photographers worked for them, and they distributed them for free to get publicity to support what they were doing, which was trying to provide services and camps and so forth for people.
And she didn't have any trouble supporting herself financially from the photographs that she did and the work she did from the government and the photojournalism.
Well, I don't know. She was married, so her husband worked for UC Berkeley. I don't know exactly. They ended up with a nice house in Berkeley in the hills. I don't know about that aspect of it. I'm sure she wasn't buying designer clothes or anything with what she got.
We have a couple comments about absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Somebody else said, I remember a similar Dorothea Lange retrospective at the Oakland Museum a few years ago.
Yes.
Pandemic. The Richmond photos show a lot of what Betty Reed Soskin described in her talk at the Rosie the Riveter Museum.
Right. That was a great exhibit 3-4 years ago in the before times. And that exhibit traveled all over the world. It went to London for sure, and a couple of places in the United States. And when it came back, the Oakland Museum used to have one gallery of Dorothea Lange photos up all the time. But since the retrospective came back, they've expanded and they've got like 3 galleries. So it's not, obviously it's not as big as the retrospective, but there's a little bit of every period represented in there now.
And Bruce said on the museum's retrospective, it was pointed out that the grocer who was later interned, his property was confiscated and a portion of the museum's building now sits on that ground.
Yeah, very possibly. I know that the houses that she took the picture of is right where the museum is now. I know, really.
And Carol said, hearing you talk about these powerful photos gives them even more meaning. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Let's see, I thought I had a couple more. I noticed that a few of the earlier photos look like that they were fading, or is that the way that she developed the photography?
That is probably the quality of the images that I ripped off the internet. I mean, I don't know. You can't really talk about the quality of the images unless you actually see them. So I wouldn't know about that.
Yeah. Let's see if I had anything else. I think that answers all of my questions. You said that the Oakland Museum is now open. Is it open for everybody or just for museum members now?
I think it's open now for everybody. Last weekend was members opening, and it's only open the weekends. It's only 3 days a week, but I believe it's open for everybody now. So, and the garden is new. They've had a revamp of the garden and so forth. It's very nice.
So it's so exciting that the museums are open, but I noticed that those who attend still need to wear masks. So if you're going to bring your mask. So
bring your mask.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a marvelous talk, Avril. We really enjoyed it, and we learned so much about an amazing artist. So
yeah, well, thank you very much for having me and for your kind comments.
Okay. So thank you to our viewers for joining us for the introduction or the reintroduction to the photography of Dorothea Lange, whose images gave a face to the distress and suffering of the nation and influenced future generations of photojournalists. And a special thanks tonight to our docent, Avril Angevine, for the remarkable story. And for all of us amateur photographers, she's truly an inspiration. We have a terrific upcoming Friends at Home program. Please join us on July 14th from Sea to Shining Sea with paintings of the 19th century American artists who depicted the country spirit as defined by the landscape. And we wrap up the month on July 20th with author and San Franciscan Aaliyah Volz, who will talk about her new award-winning memoir, Home Baked, My Mom, Marijuana, and the Stoning of San Francisco. So please join us, and please sign up for our mailings to receive advance notice about future events and invite your friends to join us as well. We are planning to continue virtual programming through the end of the year. A special recognition to our production team, David Beal, Kumar Fonzie, Karen Manuel, Debbie Reinschmidt, and Becky Sear. Finally, please consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com or check the chat for a link. Watch our website, newsletter, weekly reminders, and Facebook page for additional events and to register. Finally, thanks to you, our audience, for joining us. Good night.